Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with two guests, Dr. Anders Corr, publisher of the Journal of Political Risk, and Rick Fisher, senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. They touch on the AUKUS deal between Australia, the UK, and the US, the blowback from France, and what it means going forward. Let's dive in. Thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you for having me on, Tiffany.
Thank you.
So recently, the AUKUS deal between Australia, the UK, and the US has caused quite the stir on the international stage. So to begin, can you kind of sum up what the deal is and why it's so big?
First and foremost, the deal is for new nuclear submarines for Australia. Those are not nuclear weapon submarines per se. They're powered, their engines are powered by nuclear plants. And those submarines can go much farther and stay out much longer at sea than the traditional diesel-electric submarines that were going to be provided by France. So France is upset because they've lost a multi-billion-dollar deal to produce more than 12 submarines for Australia. And then there are other elements to the AUKUS deal, for example, cybersecurity and closer intelligence sharing. So because of this, France feels shut out of the alliance, and they feel that this was done behind their back. However, the deal, I think, originated actually back about 3 months ago when Biden went to Europe and he tried to get support from Germany and France for being tougher on China. And France and Germany did not see eye to eye with Biden on the China issue. They don't see China as big as a threat as the Americans do. And so this naturally, I think, led Biden to look to his more traditional allies in the Five Eyes for support in a stronger stance on the China issues. Biden initially went to France and Germany and asked for a closer alliance on China, and they refused. So the current upset from France is really is a bit of, tempest in a teapot. The bigger issue here is that it's going to improve strategic stability in Asia, which is the most important thing globally right now, not one deal or another on some particular small weapon system.
AUKUS came about largely because of mounting threats from China to Australia. For the last 20 years, China has been trying to gradually create an economic dependence in Australia, a dependence based on commerce with China. And about 5 to 8 years ago, it started blatantly using that advantage for political and economic leverage, and in the last few years has tried to turn that leverage into coercive power. The Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated Australia's political system and has engaged in quite blatant and loud and consistent economic threats and even military threats. In fact, the day that AUKUS was announced, the Chinese Communist Party inner voice, if you will, the Global Times, produced a blatant nuclear threat against Australia. It stated that if Australia obtains nuclear-powered submarines, that China will feel obliged to strike Australia with nuclear weapons if it so chooses. Now, this is very unfortunate because the Australians, the Americans, and the Brits have made very clear that this transfer of nuclear-powered submarine technology will not contain or include any nuclear weapons technology. The Australian public rejects even nuclear power plants and would reject nuclear weapons as well. But the nuclear-powered submarine seems to be popular. Australians understand that China is a real threat and that having its own independent nuclear-powered submarines will give the Australians a much better capability to deter China as China's Navy grows larger, as it builds more aircraft carriers, more nuclear-powered submarines, sends its fleet into the Indian Ocean, to Africa, even Latin America. Australians understand that the Americans are going to be preoccupied increasingly, and so the Americans won't have nuclear submarines to spare. And so having their own is a very good idea.
And so with this kind of technology, the U.S. used to share this with the U.K. back in the 1960s to fend off the Soviet Union. So why would the U.S. be willing to share it now?
The United States is in a tough position. The Biden administration's poorly executed withdrawal from Afghanistan, the embarrassment of that withdrawal, the basically the overnight creation of a revived global terrorist threat has rattled American allies, not just in Australia and in Asia, but around the world. American strategic credibility, American leadership is now under grave question. An initiative like AUKUS, which has been in the works for some time, in the near term, allows the Biden administration to shift the attention away from Afghanistan and gives the opportunity for the United States to do what it does best, organize allies to meet a common threat. Now, Australia has been debating whether to acquire nuclear submarines for probably close to 2 decades. It most recently decided to buy non-nuclear powered submarines from France about 4 years ago. But as that deal unfolded, the Australians became increasingly dissatisfied with it. And they approached the United States, they approached the British, who thought the time was right. China's military might is growing so quickly that it is time right now, given that it's going to take 10 years for Australia to acquire these submarines, to start the process and give the Australian public the confidence, the security that it deserves as an ally in good standing with the United States, Britain, and in the Western Alliance.
The Australia deal was recognized by Prime Minister Morrison as the most significant agreement for Australia on the defense level since the 1950s, and that was the defense agreement with the United States. But the issue is China. Australia is realizing that China is becoming so powerful and so belligerent that it needs to start moving the dial towards possibly a nuclear deterrent. This is a step in that direction, even though they deny it is the case. So Prime Minister Morrison denies it's a step towards a nuclear weapon, but I believe that because these submarine delivery systems can deliver nuclear weapons, if they're supplied with them, I think that they are actually potentially a step in that direction. And I think China is taking it that way. I think China takes it very seriously. They realize that these nuclear submarines have the range to go all the way up to mainland China, as opposed to the diesel electric submarines that France was going to supply, which really wouldn't have that extended range and power to go up there for an extended period of time.
So speaking of France, because that seems to be the huge topic in the news lately, why do you think Australia switched from, because France lost billions of dollars with the deal?
Well, Australia actually says that they did talk to France in advance of the deal, that they told France that because of some problems with the French submarines that were being provided, that they weren't sure that they could hold on to the deal. Scott Morrison said that. And I think that France knew about this. I think maybe they didn't know all the details.
Well, there are military as well as political reasons. The military reasons are pretty clear. A nuclear-powered submarine doesn't have to be refueled for the 30 years of its lifespan. You put the nuclear fuel rods in the reactor once, and it just keeps on going. It can travel as far as the food holds out. The usual patrol length for an American attack submarine is about 3 months. And in 3 months, the Australian nuclear submarine, just like all other nuclear submarines, can circle the globe because they can travel underwater at speeds in excess of 30 knots, approaching 40 miles an hour, and that's very fast for such a large vehicle. And underwater, routinely, American nuclear submarines cross the Pacific Ocean in just a few days, and as they do the Atlantic Ocean. So Australia wanted that flexibility. It wanted the ability to be able to get into the South China Sea very quickly and be able to retaliate against a Chinese strike against Australia or an Australian interest. It wanted the ability to very rapidly get out into the Pacific Ocean, into the South Pacific, should China send an aircraft carrier battle group into the South Pacific, where it would threaten the small South Pacific nations or even New Zealand. Now, the politics of it is also complicated. It appears that the last several Australian prime ministers have all had their own submarine program. It has been an unfortunate trend that the successor will change or alter or cancel the submarine program of his predecessor. And in fact, today, you have indications from the opposition party in Australia, the Labour Party, that if circumstances made it necessary, that they might cancel the nuclear submarine deal with Britain and the United States. So there's a political component and also a military component as to why Australia needs these submarines. And the military component is very compelling. Australia clearly needs a submarine system that can give it the independence required to deter China.
And so with the outrage from France, some critics are questioning why the U.S. is helping Australia, which seems very far away on the other side of the world, while kind of leaving out France, a much closer ally. So what's important about this Indo-Pacific region that would cause that?
There's been a pivot to Asia since President Obama decided that the bigger threat is coming from China rather than Russia or terrorism. Now, of course, we do have a resurgence of terrorism recently, so there is going to be a bit more attention on that. But the whole pivot to Asia has been happening. Obama started it. Trump continued the process. Now Biden is continuing the process. So it's really a bipartisan issue in Washington that really takes the increasing belligerence of China and the increasing really totalitarianism very, very seriously. And part of that is a nuclear protection against China. So while the submarines are technically nuclear powered rather than holding nuclear weapons, the Tomahawk missiles, cruise missiles that will be included on those submarines could carry nuclear weapons if the U.S. at some point or the UK decides to provide those weapons to Australia. So it is a very serious issue.
Well, historically, there is a real difference in the American strategic relationship with Australia versus that of France. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, even into the 80s, France maintained a steady distance from the United States. It was not part of the NATO alliance, the active parts of the NATO alliance. And France hewed an independent foreign policy that was more favorable, at a minimum, towards the former Soviet Union. After the Cold War, France took some significant turns and joined the active part of the NATO alliance, and also has significant security interests in the South Pacific. It has territories that it governs, and it faces a minimum amount of naval forces in the South Pacific. However, the American alliance with Australia has been strong and unabated since the United States won the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942. The Australian alliance is very close. Australia is one of the closest partners in intelligence sharing with the United States. Australia played a critical role in the early history and current history of the American space program. Australia has been a constant customer for American military technology, and Australia has been a reliable and consistent ally contributing to the conflicts that the United States has had to fight, starting with Korea, the Vietnam War, and the Middle East wars.
So some have mentioned these three countries are kind of the core of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, leaving out Canada and New Zealand.
Your mention of Canada and New Zealand is interesting. The Canadians have largely been positive, but also preoccupied with their recent elections. But in New Zealand, there was something of a shock. The New Zealanders were not consulted about this, and on the same day that the deal was announced, New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern affirmed New Zealand's longstanding anti-nuclear law, which prohibits all nuclear-powered vessels and nuclear-armed vessels, ships, aircraft, or whatever, from entering into New Zealand territory. Now, this law, which was passed in 1987, emerged from policy decisions in the 1986 timeframe, which caused the United States to end alliance obligations to New Zealand. We do not promise to defend New Zealand from attack. And this is at a time today when China has the ability right now to put about 10,000 troops in two armored brigades. They could put one on the North Island and one on the South Island of New Zealand and overwhelm the New Zealand army very quickly. The irony is that in the future, should China want to invade New Zealand would have little choice but to call on Australia to send the nuclear-powered submarines to intercept the Chinese fleet. Now, the Chinese fleet will also include nuclear-powered submarines. So there's a big question. Will the Australian submarines be good enough to sink the Chinese nuclear submarines in order to sink the Chinese invasion fleet? And that may take a while, so that the Australian submarines may be confronting the Chinese invasion fleet in New Zealand territorial waters. New Zealanders, unfortunately, are not really apprised of how much danger their anti-nuclear legislation has created for them. When these policies were decided in the 1980s, they were led by a small covert collection of very left-wing labor officials and politicians that were actually receiving money from the former Soviet Union. Few New Zealanders are aware of this history, and so they think that their anti-nuclear law was a victory for the planet, a victory for nuclear disarmament and such, but it's really nothing like that. It's only made them more vulnerable to Chinese coercion, and now, as the Chinese fleet gets bigger, to actual Chinese attack.
So with this core pact, these three countries, What are the benefits of it?
Well, for Australia, the benefits are first the acquisition of the nuclear submarines, but the pact also promises to be much more. Um, it will also facilitate, it will create the security mechanisms to allow Australia to have access to a much wider array of cutting edge American and British military technologies. I mean, things that we can only speculate: laser technology, quantum computing, space technologies, whatnot. That is part of the what will evolve in AUKUS. AUKUS is also becoming a platform for devising intermediate measures to assist Australian security before the submarines can be built. There's already speculation and even some mention by Australian officials that Australia may lease or at least allow the United States to station in Australian naval bases a small number of nuclear attack submarines, which would not only provide a deterrent capability to assist Australia, but would also be part of the transition, training the Royal Australian Naval personnel for their eventual acquisition of these same submarines.
I think it's going to provide greater stability. So, for example, when the pact was announced, some commentators, not me, but some commentators predicted that China would react with a much more belligerent attitude. But in fact, what we've seen recently is a couple of moves by Xi Jinping to back off. So, for example, he stated that China would not be building coal-fired power plants internationally outside of China, and China also is attempting to join the TPP, the new TPP, which is 11 countries, mostly in Asia. And of course, I would strongly advise those countries not to allow China into their trade agreement. It's also called the Pacific Trade Pact, because once China gets into that agreement and they have free access to all of these 11 countries' markets, China will be able to flood them with cheap goods and destroy the industries and jobs in those countries.
So going forward, do you think other countries would be added to the pact?
I think Japan could be added to the pact quite easily because they have a very clear vision of the dangers from China. I think Taiwan could be added to the pact, which would be a very controversial move, especially for Beijing, but I think it could be something that is done. South Korea could be added. I do think that we need to integrate our alliances more closely with those countries that really do understand the threat that's coming from the Chinese Communist Party, and I think all of those countries could be potential allies in the fight, actually.
That is indeed possible. It would probably be more likely that in the near term, especially given France's disappointment at having lost the non-nuclear submarine deal with Australia, that the Allies would gather and encourage France to market its nuclear-powered submarine technology to India. India operates Russian-built nuclear-powered attack submarines, but it is co-producing French non-nuclear powered submarines, and it is possible. We have to find out. It is possible that India may prefer to build a French nuclear-powered submarine, having invested so much in its non-nuclear submarine technology, which would allow the Indian Navy to profit from some rationality in that both submarines would share many parts and components. But as for Japan, that is indeed an interesting question. Nuclear allergies, political nuclear allergies, are much more powerful in Japan, even more than in Australia. It would be a tough sell to the Japanese public to justify the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines when the Japanese Navy cooperates so closely with the American Navy. American nuclear submarines are constantly making port visits to Japanese naval bases. So there, and Japan is very expert in the development and production of advanced non-nuclear powered submarines. So they may be satisfied with the submarine fleet that they have right now and with their ability to call on their American allies for the time being.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Tiffany, thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with Dr. Anders Corr and Rick Fisher. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.